A Father's Promise by Donnalynn Hess. Chapter 15. The Secret Place. November 1939. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not unto thine own understandings. Proverbs 3:5. Crouching down, Rudy pressed himself against the cold stone wall of the building. It was the last stronghold he could cling to, for he had reached the outskirts of the city. He knew that about 50 yards before him was the Germans' watchtower. Beyond that lay the open country, then the forest. At first, when he peered into the distant darkness, he could see only the tops of the tallest forest trees, outlined in the moonlight. They looked as if they had been traced in silver on a deep blue velvet sky, and for a moment, as he gazed on them, he forgot his fears. But then the searchlight from the Nazis' watchtower turned on its rotation. The harsh white beam cut through the darkness, accenting the tiny spikes in the barbed wire and making the two guards look almost ghost-like as they moved with the light along the fence. Rudy recreated in his mind the map his father had drawn for him, and with his eyes he followed the soldiers. Followed the soldiers' path until he came to the point of escape. It was just as his father had said. The wire was sagging. Make it to the fence and getting under that wire were not going to be easy. He sat for several minutes trying to think through his actions. He would have to calculate exactly the time it would take and the spot he was aiming for, and he would have to do it in pitch dark. After studying the path of the light, he decided that it passed the desired spot about every 60 seconds. He was not at all sure that he could run the 50 yards to the fence and slide under the wire in that time he had. He then turned over the possibility of running halfway on one rotation and completing his escape on the second rotation. It was possible that the tall grass could hide his figure from the beam if he managed to get out of its most direct light, but he was not sure of that either. The more he thought about it, the more he believed that it was best to try to make it all at once. The night was cold, but he found that he was sweating. He wanted to tear his coat off, but he knew that would be foolish. So he sat there, sweating, waiting, watching. As the searchlight made its round, watching, as the searchlight made its round several more times. Reminding himself of God's promise to his father, he at last gained the courage to dart out into the darkness. As he did so, he felt as if his body were moving without his guidance, as if he were still leaning back against the wall, watching himself run forward. He glanced to his right. The light seemed to be coming much faster than he had thought it would. When he finally reached his destination, he stretched out his hand and grasped the wire. It was taut. Frantically, he ran his fingers along the fence until he felt the wire sag. By this time, the light had already passed the halfway mark. He scrambled to the point of escape and lifted the wire over his head. He slid beneath it. He had only to bring his left leg out from under the fence when something caught. He pulled and pulled, but the leg of his trousers seemed hopelessly entangled in the barbed wire. He gave it one last yank, and as he did, he felt tiny spikes tear his flesh. Then he was free. He lifted his legs and rolled himself over just before the searchlight reached him. Burying his face in the cold, wet grass, he waited. It seemed as if he could feel the heat from the light hovering over him. He dared not look up. If he were to be shot, he did not want to see the bullet coming. He listened for gunfire, but the only thing he heard was the pounding of his heart and his own rapid breathing. He did not know how long it was before he gained the courage to turn his head to one side. When he did, he saw the light had passed him at least once and was already coming around him again. He lay very still. By this time, he turned his face to the ground, only long enough for the light to pass over him. As soon as he was covered once again in darkness, he began moving away from the fence and out into the field, keeping as close to the ground as he could. Grabbing hold of a clump of grass with his right hand, he pulled his left knee up and pushed himself forward. He then reached out with his left hand to clutch the grass and pulled his right leg up. Again and again, he thrust himself forward until his muscles in his arms and legs began to stiffen. But in spite of the pain, he knew he could not stop. He had to keep moving forward, moving straight ahead. He had to make it to the dirt road. Only then would it be safe to stand. Thus he continued, left, right, left, right, left, right. He was at least 30 minutes before his hand. It was at least 30 minutes before his hand reached out and touched hard earth. He tried standing, but found that his muscles immediately rebelled, and he was forced to sit back down for a few moments. After rubbing his thighs and shoulders almost savagely, he managed to ease the cramping, and he tried standing up once more. He still ached all over, but he could walk. Glancing back toward the city, he saw that the beam from the searchlight was only faintly visible. At last he was well away from the Nazi watchtower and its light. The forest lay just ahead. As he began walking, he noticed that the soft twilight that covers the world just before dawn had settled on the fields and wrapped itself about the forest trees. He slowed his pace, for the closer he came to the forest, the more reluctant he was to enter. He decided that once he had reached its edge, he would sit down and watch the sunrise. After all, Oscar had refused to set a definite time for their rendezvous. He said only that he would meet Rudy at the appointed place, sometime before nightfall. There was no need to hurry. Minutes later, he was leaning against the knotty trunk of an enormous tree. He looked down at his leg. It was still bleeding, but the cuts were not deep. Cupping his hand, he scooped up a clump of snow that had settled on one of the scrubby bushes next to him and pressed it against the wound. As the snow melted, it took away the sting. He then took out the knife his father had given him and cut a piece of cloth from his ragged pant leg and wrapped it tightly about the cut. Once his leg was bandaged, he relaxed, and leaning back against the tree, he looked up. By now, there were streaks of purple, orange, and gold splashed against the gray horizon. If he could hold this moment full of color and quiet, it was very, very quiet. There were no sirens, no guns, no cracking whips, no weeping. The only sound was the soft creaking of young trees bending in the winter wind. His thoughts turned to his father, and he wondered whether the Nazis had returned for him. If so, he knew that they would have come just before sunrise. They always did. It occurred to him that the truck taking the prisoners to work camps would have to pass on the road before him. It would be soon. He decided to wait and see whether his father was indeed one of the prisoners on the truck. If he were not, well, perhaps he would go back. The morning sun was growing brighter. Thus, Rudy decided that it might be better if he moved back behind some of the trees. He did not really know if or when the Germans ventured out beyond their watch, and there was no sense of taking chances. Besides, since he was not that far from the road, he would be able to hear the truck approaching. He had barely taken up his new post when he heard the familiar rumbling. He stepped out cautiously and crouched down. The truck was still quite a way off, but even from a distance he could see that, unlike the other trucks he had seen, this one was not open. It had a canvas covering. It would be impossible to see all, if any, of the prisoners. Still, he determined that he would try. How laboriously it moved over the dirt road. It seemed ages before it was close enough for him to see clearly. When at last it was near enough, Rudy noticed that the canvas was not securely tied. As the covering flapped carelessly in the wind, it looked to Rudy as if all the men and women were huddled together on the floor of the truck, trying to stay warm. All except one. Rudy recognized his father's lanky frame standing at the very back of the truck. He was holding on to one of the curved bars over which the canvas was draped. His face was calm, and though he did not look toward the forest, it seemed to Rudy that he knew his son was watching. The truck passed slowly, but not slowly enough for Rudy. He rushed from tree to tree, unwilling to let it out of his sight, but soon he stopped running, for he realized that it was useless to do so. He had to admit to himself that it was useless to do so. He admitted to himself that there was no turning back, and the thought made him feel lonelier than he had ever felt before. Reaching inside his coat and down out inside his sweater, he ran his fingers across his mother's letter. "This war can't last forever," he reminded himself. Then his father's words came back to him. "You must trust me, Rudy, just as I must trust my heavenly Father. Please, son, please don't let me down." "I won't, Papa," he said aloud in an effort to stir up his courage. Then he turned and walked into the forest.